These primitive Londoners were probably Celts, worshipping pagan gods, gods of nature, of the rivers, of the trees. And the first invader of the nation at that time was Julius Caesar, who came first in 55 BCE, but it was an exploratory expedition. He didn't settle here, but he was followed in 43 AD CE by another Roman emperor, Claudius, who came this time with an army, and he turned the little town of Londinium, as it was called, into his capital. The Romans, fairly early on, were thwarted, first of all, by a woman. When I was at school, we called her Boadicea, but I think now she's universally known as Boudica. And she was very badly treated, she and her tribe in East Anglia, by the Romans. And in revenge, she brought her tribes down from the east, down into London, ravaged the city, burnt it to the ground, and killed every inhabitant. Can we see the slide of the... Can you go on, Nick? Thank you. That's the present statue of Boudica on the Thames near the temple. The Romans were outnumbered. They didn't even try to defend the city. But after Boudica had gone, they rebuilt London. They rebuilt this time with a great defensive wall. Thank you. We have the wall. Thank you. That's the part of the old Roman London Wall near the Tower of London. And you can still see parts of it near the Museum of London. They constructed all the buildings necessary for a capital city, including a basilica, which wasn't then a church, but a civic centre, and an amphitheatre, which has been reconstructed in the basement of the Guildhall. And it's open to the public, you can go down and see it. But most importantly, they erected temples to their gods. And among these was Mithras, one of the Eastern gods worshipped by the Romans, particularly the military. And the worship of Mithras came originally from Persia, one of the gods of the mysteries, with a complicated system of belief, of initiation, of temple construction. Could we see the temple? Thank you. This is the reconstructed Mithraeum, the temple which you can also visit at the Bloomberg Centre in Walbrook. It's only a few yards from where the original site was of the temple, discovered after the war, when the bombs had obliterated so much of London. And they found the base of the temple, and they've rebuilt it with some of the original stone, so that you can see exactly what the people of London, of Roman London, would have seen 2,000 years ago. It's usually believed that it was St. Augustine who brought Christianity to Britain. But there were already Christians living in some of the distant places of the country before the Pope sent that group of Christian missionaries to convert the British. There were monasteries at Jarrow and at Iona, but when Augustine arrived in Kent in 597, Christianity took a hold of this country, which it has never relinquished. He set up a centre, not in London, strangely enough, which was the biggest city, but in Canterbury. And he became the first Archbishop of Canterbury and sent out his fellow monks to convert the English. The first known bishop of London was a man called Restitutus, even before Augustus arrived. And since then, London has always had its own diocese, its own see, though it is part of the province of Canterbury. As you know, there are two provinces, Canterbury and York. And in a relatively short space of time, London and Britain was converted. Of course, you have to remember that there was only one form of Christianity then, and that was Roman Catholicism, governed by the Pope, the Vicar of Rome. There are several churches in London claiming to be the oldest. This is one of them, may we see? That's Augustine receiving from. This is the old part of one of the oldest churches, believed to be the oldest in London, the Church of All Hallows at the Tower. St. Bartholomew's, of course, St. Bartholomew's the Great in Smithfield is the oldest continuous place of worship in London. The original St. Paul's Cathedral, burnt down many times, predates them both. With the coming of the Normans, this is the Bayeux tapestry, which shows the advent of the Norman kings fighting the Battle of Hastings. The Normans under William brought another religion to be established in London. He brought with him from Rouen a group of Jews. They'd been employed at the court there. The principal profession was money lending, with a few dealers in precious stones and a few doctors. And they settled in a part of London marked today by the street still called Old Jewry, bounded by London Wall in the north and Aldersgate to the west, and then Gresham Street, which was called Cat Street in those days, to the south, and Coleman Street to the east. There was a serious riot in 1190 at the coronation of Richard I, when the Jews were refused entry to the abbey to celebrate coronation, and most of the jewelry was destroyed in the riots. The Jews, this is them debating with Christians, were actually the property of the king. He actually owned them, and they were much maligned. They were done for their money until it had almost gone, and the Lombards from Italy, remember Lombard Street, came in to take their place as moneylenders to the court, the aristocracy, the church, all borrowing money from the Jews and then from the Lombards. And in 1290, as we know, Edward I, finding that they were of now little use to him because they had no money left, and they were banished from the kingdom, not to return until Oliver Cromwell in 1655 allowed them back. So now only the Catholic religion rules supreme in the city. That is until Henry VIII married Catherine. Could we see the beautiful? This is Henry. The previous slide is of Henry VII's beautiful chapel in Westminster Abbey. This was painted in, of course, the 18th century. But Henry, his son, Henry VIII, married Catherine, the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, who was unable to give him the one thing he most desired, which was a son. And as we know, his eye was caught by Anne Boleyn, the Queen's lady in waiting, and he tried to annul his marriage, no divorce, of course, under Catholic law. And to do this, he had to prove that that marriage of Catherine to his older brother Arthur, which lasted only a few months, was not permitted. That meant insisting that there never had been such a marriage. In other words, that it had never been consummated. Catherine said it never had. Arthur, the bridegroom, said it had. The Pope refused to allow the king to annul the marriage. He was determined to get his way, and Henry declined to admit the papal decision, and he declared himself to be the supreme head of the church in England, which meant that he could do as he liked as far as religious matters were concerned. And he duly annulled his current marriage, and he married Anne, who was already pregnant with the baby who was to become Queen Elizabeth. And England broke with Roman Catholicism to become a Protestant country. Of course, that wasn't the end of the matter. Henry didn't want to start a new religion, only to break free of papal control. However, there were new ideas coming from the continent, in particular from Martin Luther and other men like Calvin and Zwingli, who demanded change, and that brought religious controversy and internal struggles. When Henry died and his young son Edward came to the throne as a young man, they started a rule of persecution and retribution on those Catholics who had retained their faith. Burning at the stake became a national punishment, and when Edward was succeeded by his half-sister Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and a fervent Catholic like her mother, the tables turned again and the burnings at Smithfield multiplied, and this time it was those who accepted the new religion, the Protestants, who were tied to the stake and died in the flames. Smithfield is a very interesting part of London. Could we see, please, the next picture? This is the Charterhouse, a beautiful old building which was originally a monastery, is now a home, almshouses for elderly gentlemen. And it is still a beautiful place to visit. It has a museum and well worth it if you are in that area, Barbican area of London. Also nearby is St. Bartholomew's the Great. Still, most of it is still extant. Some of it was repaired by after the fire of London, but it's still well worth visiting, near to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Also there is, could we see the next one? This is the little fat boy who marks the point at which the fire of London finished. All in the same area, so if you're visiting, it is well worth wandering around to see these rather handsome places. Mary was married to another strong Catholic, Philip II of Spain. She died without issue, though she suffered several fourth pregnancies, and the throne went to the one person who had the strength of personality to iron out England's religious problems, Elizabeth I. The new Queen's policy of live and let live allowed England, and particularly London, to gain some peace, at least as far as religion was concerned. This didn't mean, of course, that the Catholics could worship in public or that the Jews could return. But if they were modest, if they kept their heads down, those who preferred a faith outside the national religion were on the whole left alone. Although the Jews were still officially banned, we do know that there were Jews living in Tudor England. Elizabeth, you probably know, had a Jewish doctor, Rodrigo Lopez. He was accused of plotting to poison her and condemned to death. But the Queen called him "my little Jew," and she seems to have been very fond of him. Plots against the Queen's life in various attempts to restore England to Catholicism and put Mary of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, on the throne came to nothing. Elizabeth did finally, after much havering, agree to Mary's execution. And it was Mary's son, James, brought up as a Protestant in Scotland, who succeeded her. And in spite of his own faith being that of the nation as a whole, he did strongly believe in the divine right of kings, that the king could do no wrong. And this it was that indeed that brought down in the next generation his son Charles, who was executed in Whitehall and turned England into a commonwealth. This century was remarkable for, first of all, the plague of London, 1660, very much in our minds at the moment, because it was not unlike what we're undergoing just now. It was followed by the fire of London, with so much of London destroyed, including St. Paul's. This is the old St. Paul's Cathedral, a magnificent Gothic cathedral, razed to the ground, completely destroyed, but rebuilt as the one that we know now, that's it. The modern St. Paul's, I say modern, of course it was built in the 17th century by Christopher Wren, and along with many other buildings and churches, all of which Wren constructed at the time. And the other important event that happened in the middle of the 17th century was the return of the Jews. In actual fact, there was no reason for them not to return, because the original act which banished them was not on the statute books. Their expulsion in 1290 had been by royal command, and this applied only to those whom it was pronounced against at the time. There is still controversy about whether or not the Jews could have come back earlier, whether they need not have been banished, but in effect, they did come back after the petition presented to Cromwell, and he allowed them back because he wanted their money. And indeed, many of the merchants of London did not want to welcome the Jews back, but back they came. They formed a community in London and several other larger towns, building synagogues and instituting all the necessary arrangements that such a community needed. The first synagogue was in Church Lane, just off Houndsditch, soon followed by the magnificent Bevis Marks. This is the interior, the Ark of the Covenant inside Bevis Marks. I'm sure many of you will have visited. It's based on a very, very similar synagogue in Amsterdam, and it was designed by a Quaker. He refused to take any money for building this because he said it was built to the glory of God. There was another synagogue shortly afterward called the Great Synagogue, which some of you or your ancestors will remember, for the German-speaking Jews. Don't forget that Bevis Marks was Spanish Portuguese, the Sephardi community. And could we see the next one? The scrolls within the Ark. This is actually from West London, and all of you will know what happens inside the synagogue. And the Jews of London came together very interestingly. I was doing some research recently on and comparing the COVID virus with the Great Plague of London at about this time. And in spite of the fact that so many people died in time of the Great Plague, the Jews lost only 8 people out of about 200. And the reasons for that, some of them are fairly obvious. The Jews were, first of all, they paid much attention to hygiene. They kept their food carefully, and they didn't communicate. In other words, they were in lockdown, and they didn't have much to do with the rest of London, and they managed to withdraw through the plague almost completely untouched. About this time, new religions began springing up. These were for those Christians who didn't want to affiliate to the Church of England, the nonconformists, the dissenters. They included the Quakers and many other smaller sects, the Levellers, the Diggers, the Ranters, the Muggletonians, and several more. Some of them refused to accept Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Some were Sabbatarians, and they kept Saturday as the Sabbath, and others expected the second coming to be imminent and the end of the world to be nigh. After 2 attempts to restore the Catholic faith and a Catholic king, James II, on the throne, England refused ever again to be directed by a pope far away in Rome. When the Hanoverians came to the monarchy, it was established by law that no Catholic could succeed to the throne of England. And in fact, until recently, nor could a man or a woman who was married, who had a spouse who was a Catholic. That's now been changed. And although the monarch must be the head of the English church, his wife or husband could still belong to the Catholic faith. The Catholics in England in the 18th century were still under suspicion. There was an attempt in 1778 to allow them a degree of freedom by proposing a Catholic Relief Act. And this met with considerable opposition, and it led to riots which almost destroyed London. They were led and named after Lord George Gordon, the Gordon riots, who led the Protestant Association in 7 days of rioting and destruction, fires in the street, during which a large part of the city was razed to the ground. Not many people realize how important the Gordon riots were, in the fact that they did almost as much damage as the fire of London, indeed of the Blitz. But the interesting thing for us about the Gordon riots is that Lord George, an eccentric Scottish nobleman, escaped from London when the riots came to an end, was recaptured in Amsterdam, sent to prison, and ended up in Newgate as an Orthodox Jew. He practiced the religion in his cell. He had the commandments painted on the walls of his cell. He formed a minion out of a few of the other Jews who were there in the prison until he died, to be buried in an unmarked grave in the gardens next to Euston Station. Now, this is an interesting point. This is not the graveyard of thing. I'll come to this in a moment. Keep the slide because it's a beautiful little cemetery. But to continue with Lord Jordan on a more personal note, Rabbi Thomas Salomon, whom some of you may know, who is our minister emeritus at Westminster, was very interested in this. He wrote his dissertation for his doctorate on conversion to Judaism. And he took up the cause knowing that I was interested. And together we tried to find out a bit more about this unmarked grave and Lord George Gordon. When the new rail line, the HS2, was mooted and they were starting to expand it from Euston Station, they wanted to dig up that little cemetery off the Hampstead Road behind the station. And they came to us and asked us whether we knew whether if they dug, they would find the grave. We thought not, and sure enough, although they found many graves there and many bones, they were never able to establish where Lord George Gordon was buried. This particular picture that you see now is the little cemetery of Bunhill Fields off the City Road. It's a fascinating place to visit, with graves of many distinguished people, all dissenters, because the nonconformists, the dissenters, the Quakers, etc., were not allowed to be buried in a consecrated churchyard. So this quite large cemetery, very interesting to visit, contains the graves of people like Daniel Defoe and the Wesleys. Wesley's house, you'll see in a second, is opposite, and many others like Bunyan. This is Wesley's house and museum opposite the Bunhill Fields. That little picture you just saw of the is a little Quaker graveyard not far away from here. Yes, a little quiet, solitary little garden with a Quaker meeting house just beside it. And you can wander through there. People go there to have their lunch. And it's sitting there amidst these very modern blocks of flats around it. But it's an interesting place to see. There is only one grave there, and that is of George Fox, the originator of Quakers in this country, and it's not. The Quakers didn't believe in tombstones, so the grave is simply a flat stone in the garden, but it is a very pretty little Quaker garden, well worth a visit if you're in the area. Another problem touching the church and other communities, and one which we're very much aware of now, was slavery. The Clapham sect, as they called themselves, led by William Wilberforce, set out to abolish first of all the slave trade and then slavery itself. Missionaries went out to Africa and to Asia, bearing the Christian message, and some of the freed slaves stayed on in London to help their fellows in the appalling conditions of the slave ships. This is the plaque, and it was also appeared on various other rings, I think, and medals. Am I not a man and a brother? It's a very heartbreaking picture of a slave in chains. It wasn't until 1807 that Parliament finally passed the Abolition of Slavery Act. But gradually, London was becoming more cosmopolitan. Religions from the continent, from the Orient, were part of the London scene by now, particularly in the East End. First of all, it was the Lascars, the Eastern sailors coming up on the ships up the Thames, Irishmen fleeing famine in their own country, the Huguenots setting up silk factories in Spitalfields. Maybe you see the sign now of the Spitalfield. That is still there, a cotton bobbin, silk, for showing the silk manufacturers in some of the little streets off the Whitechapel Road. You may know them. And they lived in these tall houses with big windows at the top to let in as much light as possible for the workers. Interestingly enough, when the Jews came to the East End towards the end of the 19th century, they took over a lot of the houses and put their own workshops, their sweatshops, up in the same houses with the same windows to let in the light for the tailors. It was in the reign of Queen Victoria as Empress of India that more black faces were seen in London. By now, the synagogues had become mosques. At one time, there were about 40 tiny synagogues in the East End. Most of them went and later became mosques. And Queen Victoria herself, of course, had a Muslim servant, Abdul Karim, of whom a film has been made recently. Some of you may have seen it. And the people coming in from India, from the Indian subcontinent, some came as servants in the homes of the English rulers who had been in their own country, and others were setting up businesses of their own in the hope of improving their commercial status. Muslims and Hindus played a very important part in the First World War, when Indian regiments fought bravely beside their fellow countrymen. It was mainly due to the Gurkha regiment settling after the war in Aldershot that Buddhism came to England, led here by Christmas Humphreys, a High Court judge who showed British people a new way of life. And other buildings were being erected to cater for other religions. Could we see the next one, which is Westminster Cathedral? That's just outside Victoria Station. London, if you didn't know, has 3 cathedrals. St. Paul's, of course, Westminster Cathedral, Catholic for Catholics, and the cathedral across the river to mark the south of the country. A beautiful little cathedral near it was St. Mary's Ovary, and then it became a cathedral. The Church of England had more battles to fight. The royal family was dragged into dispute when the Prince of Wales wanted to marry a twice divorced American woman and still retain his throne. But he was head of the church in England, and the situation was critical for both church and state. Eventually, as we know, he had to abdicate, preferring, as he put it, to marry the woman I love, rather than to succeed to his throne and lose her. During World War II, almost all London's religions sent men to fight. The exceptions, of course, were the Quakers, who refused to take part on the battlefields, but they drove ambulances and they tended the wounded and they worked on the home front, particularly during the Blitz. Most faiths sent chaplains to the battle zones, and at home, Londoners shared their churches and temples and synagogues with those who'd been bombed out. Once the war, I'm sure some of you, can we just go back to St. Paul's? This remarkable picture, I'm sure some of you will remember, of St. Paul's ringed by fire during the Blitz and almost untouched. There was a small incendiary bomb actually that did go off in St. Paul's, but it didn't do much damage. What people don't remember so clearly is that not very far away at Bevis Marks, the same thing happened. Very little damage to Bevis Marks, but the great synagogue beside it, could we see that now? Thank you. That was completely destroyed by bombs. That is the morning after the bombs hit in May 1940, I think it was, hit the great synagogue, which was temporarily restored, but is now gone completely. A sad loss, because it was quite a magnificent synagogue and has stood for so many years, but the bombs destroyed it. Most of Wren's beautiful churches were damaged. Some were reconstructed. Some are now simply a tower or a small garden marking the site of some of the churches that were lost. The East End, of course, as you know, was almost completely obliterated. The Jewish community moved out to find homes in the suburbs, and its place was taken by the Muslims. There are one or two synagogues still left in the East End, though very few Jews live there now. Although, interestingly enough, I was told recently that some young Jews who are working in the city, particularly in Canary Wharf, are taking over again some of the modern replaced flats and houses and are hoping to restore the Jewish community to the East End. After the war, new faces were seen in London. Ships coming in from the West Indies brought more black faces looking for economic improvement so that they could bring their families over and find a new life. They were joined later by immigrants, mostly from the Indian subcontinent, fleeing Idi Amin's oppression in East Africa. And without them, transport and the post office, hospitals, corner shops would hardly exist today. They brought their own religions with them, colourful, musical, sometimes noisy, to enliven London and its people. This, of course, is the mosque in Regent's Park, and the next picture will show you the great white wedding cake of a temple in Neasden, a remarkable piece of construction which was actually built in India and taken piece by piece to London, where it was put together. When I visited the temple, and of course you can go, I told them who I was, and they said that they owed a great debt of gratitude to the Jews because it was the CST, the Communal Trust, who advised them on security when they put this building up, and they felt very grateful ever since. The next is, of course, the Sikh temple, which is in Shepherd's Bush, also a modern building. A large number of Sikhs now living in this country. The Gurdwara is the name of the temple. And finally, in Wimbledon, the elaborate Buddhist temple for Buddhist worshippers in London. All London's faiths were concerned by the changes in lifestyle after the war. It took a long time for women to be accepted as priests and as rabbis. Same-sex relations and finally marriage have now become possible. And the Anglican community has now very proudly appointed a woman bishop for London, who very kindly wrote the foreword for this book. New faiths, religious practices seem to spring up quite frequently. Pentecostals, charismatic congregations, Christian Scientists, even Scientology, which is now recognized as a religion. Atheism and agnosticism claim many adherents, and so do spiritual beliefs instead of conventional religion. It may well be that the Church of England will be disestablished in time, that the monarch will no longer be head of the church. Prince Charles has indicated that it possibly might happen in his time. Perhaps London won't be recognised as the capital of the UK in the time to come. But it's very interesting to wander around the city and to see something like the Gherkin, cheek by jowl with a very old church, that's St Andrews. And I think the one thing we must hope for is that people will be allowed to worship in whatever way they wish, in whatever manner they want, without fear, without racialism, or any kind of discrimination. Thank you. I'm very happy to answer any questions or to hear any points of view if anybody would like to make them.
Thank you very much indeed, Philippa. We can go to questions. If anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, I can see Tony's hand is up, and then Denise. So we'll go in that order. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, it's actually I worked around there for a while, so I know it very well. But because Redbridge itself has got 4 Sikh Gurdwaras, 4 Hindu temples, and a Buddhist temple. So we've got, and also I've actually got the book by Christmas Humphreys. So just to point out, but it's really fascinating. The Sandys Row, of course, is still there, and I think that's the only functioning synagogue is there, isn't it? Is that right?
Is what? Sorry.
Sandys Row.
Where?
Sandys Row. It's in just
No,
after.
it's not the only one.
I'm sorry. Yes, indeed, it is there, and it's recently been refurbished. It's looking very splendid in its bright blue, and it's right in Artillery Street, I think.
That's it. Yeah.
Yes. There are one or two others in the East End too, but most of them have gone.
They've gone, yeah.
My father was bar mitzvahed at Sandys Row.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And my stepdad, he was also bar mitzvahed at Sandys Row, and I think it's still used.
Oh, very much so, and they have lunchtime services too.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you, please, can I ask? Sorry, are you finished, Tony?
I just mentioned I've been to a couple of services when I was doing for my parents, and my cousin did as well. I just mentioned, sorry. Carry on, sir. I shouldn't have interrupted.
Oh, sorry. Can I ask a question? Was that Alfred, King Alfred the Great? Was he the first? Did he convert to Christianity? Was he the first Christian king?
No, he wasn't. There were Christian kings before him. The names become very confusing. Athelbert and his son, Athelstan, was converted by Augustus earlier than that. Yes, indeed. But gradually, England was becoming a Christian country, right from the top down. Somebody has just mentioned the Congregation of Jacob, which is also in also functioning in the East End. All right, anybody else?
Where is the Congregation of Jacob?
In what's the road that runs down to Bethnal
Commercial
Green?
Road.
Yes,
Commercial Road.
yes,
Commercial
Right.
Road, yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
it's a small synagogue.
I'll try and find it next time I'm up there.
Yes, it's very tiny. You have to look for it, but it's down Commercial Road going towards the east.
If I have a question, if I may, are there any if you were to talk about a hidden gem in London, a real highlight that's perhaps lesser known that would be well worth a visit, what is it? Is there a place that springs to mind, Philippa?
Oh goodness, so many. I would have started off at Smithfield and the Charterhouse, which really is a gem. There's a tiny church in Bishopsgate, St. Ethelburgers, I think it is, which is sort of about 7 feet wide. And you can miss it, but it's there and it's still functioning. And of course, any of the great synagogues are worth visiting. The Southwark Cathedral is a very beautiful little cathedral. It's recently used for state occasions occasionally. So many, you could just walk forever. And if you go to Bow Church, St. Mary's Bow, which is Bow Bell's church. And incidentally, it's got a very nice little vegetarian restaurant in the basement, in the crypt. So that's worth a visit. And some of the modern reconstructions are worth looking at. In Guildhall and the Bloomfield Centre. And so many that really you could wander forever and not see it all.
I worked in Clerkenwell, and that's also got all sorts of funny little corners and things like bookbinders and weird shops. But because the other thing is, if you're feeling a bit footsore, you want to have a sit down and a quiet read, the Bishopsgate Library is a great place.
Oh yes, it's got a great tradition too, hasn't it? Of I think left-wing associations.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yes, certainly.
And Toynbee Hall has as well, hasn't it? I think.
Oh, there's plenty to see.
And there's a Postman's Park as well, which I used to live right near there.
I don't know that.
Oh, that's you're coming out of St. Paul's. It's near the Barbican.
Yes.
And it's a little tiny park. I'm trying to think. It's off. It's as you're coming out of St. Paul's and you're walking down towards the Barbican. Before you get to the Barbican, there's a small park. And what somebody did was in the back of it, when there's somebody's done something heroic and died, or a child or something like that, they put up a little plaque.
Oh, really? I don't know that. I must go and have a look.
It's actually opposite Bart's Hospital.
Oh, right.
Yes.
I must go and have a look at that. I don't know.
It's between St. Martin le Grand and King Edward Street.
Yeah.
King Edward Street.
Yeah, that's right. Where Bart's is, yeah.
Yes, just in front of the new entrance of Bart's. Yeah.
I know where you mean. Yes.
And the plaque, the tiles, by the way, are ceramic, and they were all designed by George Frederick Watts, the late Victorian artist. Yeah.
There's also a very interesting plaque in Smithfield, West Smithfield, also part of the hospital, to the Peasants' Revolt. It's a modern plaque, but it's beautifully made. And you can wander right round Smithfield because Smithfield's meat market itself is now going to be the new Museum of London. They're going to keep the meat market, I think, in the basement or something, and rebuild the Museum of London in the old Smithfield market.
Yes, it's also near
Okay, well,
what they call it, the Silicon Roundabout as well. Is not that far from there. Clerkenwell.
Roundabout by the museum. Do you mean?
No, I think it's where all the IT people were congregating.
Oh, yeah, near Old Street, that is, isn't it?
The Old Street, yeah.
Yes.
I worked around there for a while.
well, thank you. Thank you for your question. Denise, did you have your hand up before? Was there a final question that you wanted to ask? Is that right? If so, you'll need to unmute. There we go. We're unmuting. This will be the last question. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to know, were there any Jews that didn't go when Edward the First expelled the Jews?
Yes, there certainly were. Don't get me started on that, because I'm working on some research on that now. But the most interesting story is the one about the Queen Elizabeth's Jewish doctor, of which there's a lot of information. He was Portuguese, and he was reputed to take a bribe for poisoning the Queen, instigated by the Spanish king. I don't think he did it, but time will tell whether the story is true or not. But he was certainly executed for it, hung, drawn, and quartered.
Oh, was it? Oh, dear.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
I read a books by an author called Anne Swinfen. Unfortunately, she passed away, but it was about a Spanish and Portuguese Jewish people living the time of Queen Elizabeth I. I don't know if you've heard of her.
I've heard of her. I haven't read any of the books.
It's just I got Eleanor Bloom, who's on here, to go. We went on a tour of all the places that she mentioned in. I think she wrote 6 books of the places she mentions in her books, and I did write to her, but unfortunately she suddenly passed away and the series was never finished. So I don't know what happened to the Portuguese doctor.
Oh, I can tell you what happened to the Portuguese doctor. That one, anyway.
Yeah. He's also mentioned in one of her books too.
Yes, the story is quite well known, but he was recognized as a Jew at a time when there shouldn't have been any Jews there at all, and that was what was interesting about it, and the fact that he was a very distinguished doctor with top aristocratic patients, including the Queen.
Rabbi Larry Becker gave us a talk on Jews in the Age of Discovery, and one of the Jews that was in Queen Elizabeth's time actually helped them beat the Spanish Armada by speeding up the production of copper so they could make brass cannons. They couldn't use iron cannons because they tend to blow up, a nasty habit of blowing up.
Yes.
Brass cannons could. And there's another one. There's actually a Marano or a Converso who actually warned him of what's his name, Robert Cecil, of the coming of the Spanish Armada, because he knew before. So there were Jews actually quite involved.
Yes, there were quite a lot of Jews. Some remained over from the banishment, and some came in fleeing from either the Spanish Inquisition or from Holland. A lot of them came. I see we have a note on the chat that remaining Jews had forced conversion at the House of Conversion Domus situated in Chancery Lane. Yes, I didn't mention the Domus Compassorum, which was a recognized place for Jews to go, ostensibly to be converted, but in fact a lot of them secretly retained their religion, and they were supported first of all by the monarch, and then the House of Converts was demolished, or rather, it became the record office, public record office in Chancery Lane, and then that went to Kew.
We could of course speak long and very deeply about history, especially when we have somebody who is weaving such a rich tapestry as Philippa has for us this evening. But at this point, I'm going to move to Stuart Spivak, who's the chairman of our community, the chairman of LLs, to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Philippa, for preparing and giving this talk this evening. Very interesting, very informative, and I think it's reminded us all of a lot of London that we'd be like happy to look around at the moment, but possibly we can't. So it's given us a lot of places to visit next spring, when hopefully we will be released back in the community. So thank you very much, and of course, hope the book goes well, and thank you for giving up of your time this evening. Thanks, Philippa, and
Thank you.
take care, everyone.
Yeah.